The TurboGrafx 16 by NEC. I want to talk about it. I had it back in the day. I was actually a huge fan of it. I want to tell you my personal stories behind it, and I want to talk about all the quirks and features and some of the good games and some of the not so good games about this notoriously bad system that kind of just flopped. I was a big fan of this system, and I'll tell you why. Just stay with me on this, okay? I am putting up my defense right now. I am, okay? I'm posing a case as though I'm in a court of law and you guys are the judge, jury, and executioner of me right now. So let me explain myself, okay? Before the system even came out in the Western version, okay, the black big one that came out, it was known as the PC Engine in Japan. A friend of mine, a friend of a friend of mine told me that he had it, that he had the PC Engine. He was from Japan, his whole family was from Japan, so they, when they moved over here to Canada, they brought all their cool Japanese stuff with them. And he had the PC Engine because this was at the time when Japanese video game systems were out in Japan way before they were out here in the West. And so we were stoked because when it's not every day that you get to play a video game system before it was even like literally invented in the country that you're in. So we got on the bus, we went down to his place. He had a really nice house in the British properties. It was all fancy, yada, yada, yada. We went downstairs. He had this cool games room all set up. He had a pool table and everything like that, but we weren't interested in that. We wanted to see the system. We looked at it. It was cool. It was cool, little teeny box. It had little teeny cards for games. They were about the size of a credit card. It was all cool. And he had a big library. He almost had all of the games for it as well. So we plugged it in. He also had this thing. It was a multi-control port so that you could plug multiple controls into it because the system itself only had one control port on it. But he had the multi-controller thing, and he had 3 controllers for it as well. So we started playing multiplayer games right away. I think there was about 4 or 5 of us in the room. But because you could play 3 players right away, it was just a lot more, like it was really exciting. The whole system, the whole experience was very exciting, especially for me. And we were playing multiplayer games, whatever ones he had, and we were having a good time with it. And we're like, this system's pretty damn good. I mean, it's definitely better than Nintendo. Was it better than Sega Genesis? I don't know. At the time, we were thinking it was pretty much on par with it, but you know, Sega Genesis, you couldn't play 3 players, 4 players, 5 players at the same time games. And he had all these Japanese games for it that we kept inter-swapping. We were just basically binging as much as we could until the parents would be like, okay, you guys got to go home now, we're having dinner or whatever, right? So it was just like a total video game feeding frenzy. So when it was all said and done, we had our fill, and we're like, this is gonna be one of the coolest video game systems when it actually comes out here. And I hyped it up all over my school, all of my friends. I told them all about it because they knew nothing about it. They never played it like I did. They never had the experience that I did. And so they were kind of stoked to get it as well. So when it was launched, I got it immediately, and some of my friends got it immediately as well. We had fun with it the first day, and I'm talking literally the first day, 24 hours, because pretty much after that, it kind of felt disappointing because when it was launched here in the West, we figured this out as well. It didn't come out with as many games as they had in Japan. Big disappointment, huge. And it got worse after that because we were like, okay, well, we'll wait a little bit. Maybe these other games that I played, the Japanese version, maybe they will eventually come out. But they didn't. They only had a handful of games and they barely trickled out any games. It would take such a long period of time before they would come up with like 1 game or 2 games for it. And they weren't even that good. They weren't spectacular titles. And we started looking it all over, and now my friends are kind of getting mad at me because I essentially hyped it up. I talked it up so much for them to buy it, and they were like, oh man, I could have got a Sega Genesis, but I didn't. I got this instead, sort of thing, right? So it's not that they wanted to kill me, but they were not only just disappointed in the system, they were disappointed in me. And when it also came out, it came out all wrong, okay? Like, if there's one video game system that I would want to recreate, like go back in time and go to NEC, bust open the doors and say, look guys, this is how you're supposed to make this system and make it work. One thing that they did wrong right away was they made all the accessories that you had to buy it separate, and they were expensive at the time. In order to play multiple players, the system only came with one control port, so even to play 2 players, you had to buy the Turbo Tap. It was like over $50, and then you had to buy a controller, again, which was over $50. And the controller's nothing elaborate either, because it just looks like a more rounded off, bigger version of a regular Nintendo controller. It only had 2 buttons on it. Big deal. It had turbo switches on it that barely anybody ever used, because most of the games had auto fire built into them anyway, blazing lasers. But anyway, if I was redesigning the system, I would have said, look, it should have 5 control ports. Just have the Turbo Tap built in. Look at how big our version is of the system, okay? It's like twice as big as the Japanese one. Why? Because I guess bigger is better, it looks better. But if you crack the system open, half of it's hollow, it's just plastic. So you can't say you didn't have the room to easily fit in the 5 controller port Turbo Tap just built into it. Next, the system had to come with 2 controllers. You couldn't just make it come with 1. That's bogus, okay? I don't care what anyone says. Even the Super Nintendo that came out later on came with 2 controllers. So there's that. You had to make the control cords longer. They were so damn short. I swear, if you stretch this out, it's got to be the shortest controller cord in the history of controllers, okay? Then, oh my God, just to put another nail in the coffin, they had this stupid thing called like the Turbo Booster or something like that. It was a dumb thing you plugged into the back of the system just so you could have like RF plugs, because the original system had to get plugged into like that stupid rickety cable screw-in thing like all of the other old school like systems had at the time. Complete flop, total disaster, stupidest thing ever. It also contributed to the death of the Sega Genesis later on with all these add-ons. All these add-ons you have to buy for your system, and it doesn't just come with it, is a complete disaster. And I'm not even gonna go on about the Turbo Express or the TurboGrafx CD as well, because either one of those things were so ridiculously expensive, none of us could afford it, and we didn't really want it anyway, because again, you didn't have very many games for that system either, and the graphics didn't change on it. They were the same TurboGrafx 16 graphics. It just had better sound because it was on CD. Way too expensive. Another nail in the coffin for the system. So now that I'm done ranting about how disastrously bad and disappointing it was, it did have some decent games for it. And the number 1 game for it for me was Splatterhouse, okay? Because I loved the arcade at the time. It was amazing when I first saw it. I never saw anything so grotesque and eerie. There's just something about that game, even playing it today. It's like watching one of those eerie old horror movies like The Exorcist or the Amityville Horror. The game itself is in that same category. It's just eerie. The weird sound effects that are in it, how they're recorded and they're kind of distorted and everything like that. It's a great game. So in order to play that game at home without spending any quarters in it was insanely cool for me. I could just binge it as much as I wanted, and I could never ever pass Jennifer's demon form part in the arcade anyway. So I kept playing it and practicing until I could end the entire game without even taking one hit. But what I didn't like about the TurboGrafx 16 version was that it was censored for ours, and the PC Engine one isn't. It has the original white terror mask that looks like a hockey mask, I get it, and they changed it to that stupid red one, and they also changed it so they took out the religious they took out religious symbols, like when you're in the church and stuff like that. There was like an upside down cross, and there were crosses on the background and stuff. So they took out some of the religious aspects to it. That makes no sense, because there were games that were out even before that had religious stuff in it automatically. Castlevania. Another kind of decent game was Ninja Spirit, again, a copy of an arcade. It's pretty all right. I mean, it's no Shinobi though, and so that's about it. I played Vigilante, I played Blazing Lasers. It's okay, but again, it's just a kind of a generic shooter, but there's not much good to talk about it. It had no role-playing games for it. There was one I had that was called Dungeon Explorer, but it is just basically a Gauntlet reskin. It's just a Gauntlet ripped-off game. The mechanics are exactly the same as it, and that's about it. One of the worst games I ever played for it, and this is the death of the system when I finally basically traded it in for something else. I said, give me whatever money you can give me for this, and I'll put it towards like Super Nintendo or something else. Just get rid of it. And that was the game called Battle Royale. It is the worst. It is the worst. I don't care what anyone says. Wrestling game of all time. It's bad, okay? You can mention some of the Nintendo ones, but I played tag team wrestling for Nintendo way more than I played this game, and I loved it, all right? There's no point. There's no wrestling moves in it. You just jam on the button, and every single wrestler's got like one move. He just keeps headbutting, or he just keeps punching, or he just keeps kicking. They all have the same, like they all have like one move, and all you do is you pick up your object of the game is pick up one of the wrestlers and throw them outside of the ring. It's like Atari. There's only like one screen. There's only one thing to do. Sure, you can play 5 players at the same time, but like I said, none of us did. So even if you, it's so bad that it just seems like a one-off game that you would play in a game like Mario Party. It's not a standalone game. So in the end, the TurboGrafx 16 and NEC made these signs for it. I kid you not. You go into Radio Shack and it said TurboGrafx 16, price slashed. It is now $19.99 for the whole system, and still nobody bought it. Then they came out with that package, that all-in-one, the Turbo Duo, where it was a CD, that was the CD system and the TurboGrafx 16, and nobody bought that one either. And that was it. It was completely kaput after that. And you know what? Sorry, Anata. I have a little bit of fond memories, but mostly when I think about the system, it just gives me a bad taste in my mouth, kind of like stale black licorice. That's it. Those are my stories and, I don't know, a little bit of a history lesson on the TurboGrafx 16. If you did like it, hit the thumbs up button. You know, I do really, really appreciate it. And if you want to see another system and stories that I have about it, click up here, or you can click this little bubble over here that says the subscribe button. And if you don't, you're going to make my grandmother very, very unhappy.